Hi, today's movie is Relic, the 2020 psychological horror film directed by Natalie Erika James and written by the director and Christian White. The film stars Emily Mortimer, Bella Heathcote and Robyn Nevin. When her elderly mother Edna goes missing from her remote country house, Kay and her adult daughter Sam make the drive to the town to help in the search for Edna. When Edna reappears a few days later, she can't or won't explain where she's been, and Sam and Kay begin to become aware of a strange presence haunting Edna's house. Is Edna suffering from dementia, madness, or is she becoming possessed by the presence in the house which seems to be linked to her own father, who had died alone and insane on the property many years before? Relic is a beautifully crafted, intensely creepy and very disturbing film. I really liked that it's ambiguous in some ways and it has moments of an almost mystical sort of beauty which reminded me a lot of Picnic at Hanging Rock. And in fact, I wondered if these moments were perhaps hinting that there was some other dimension at play in the story, and that this dimension was perhaps where the mother was disappearing to, and the scenes with the hidden rooms in the house could also perhaps be viewed this way. So what's my take on the film? Well, I felt this was a film about madness, a hereditary madness. I've spoken before in other videos about the idea that the house can be viewed as a metaphor for the mind, for the psyche, and I felt that Relic really engages very strongly with this idea. So when Edna's house is mouldy and rotting, it's symbolic of her own mind which is deteriorating. And likewise, the hidden parts of the house, like some distorted mirror of the regular parts of the house, visualizes that mind losing its structure. It's becoming this dark and confusing labyrinth with no exit and no windows to the outside world or to reality. The windows which are featured in the movie, which are inherited from the great-grandfather's shack, suggested to me the idea of this inherited madness. And the way those windows became covered over with mold again seemed to me to be about this idea of losing touch with the outside world, with reality, and becoming locked inside your own mind. The way the mold appears on the body of Edna as well as her house reinforced this idea to me that the body and the house are linked symbolically. The mold is shown in the story as originating with the great-grandfather. He is the origin of this infectious deterioration in the story, and that's emphasized through Kay's dreams and also at the end in that terrible scene where Kay peels away the outer layer of Edna's body and reveals the great-grandfather's decayed body underneath it. And I have to say, that is one of the most disturbing scenes I have ever watched, and I've watched a lot of horror. So it's only when the great-grandfather is finally acknowledged at the end that as the source of the horror that he can find peace. He was literally inside Edna. He has completely taken her place and utterly obliterated her. This is what made me think that his madness was the source of Edna's madness. That it was something genetic, and as the ending suggests, it is something that Kay will inevitably succumb to as well, as Sam sees mold on her mother's back. The film leaves us with a lot of questions. The grandmother, mother and daughter are all estranged from each other emotionally. They don't know anything about each other's lives. And we never really learn why, although I did wonder whether this kind of dysfunction within the family is supposed to be reflective of some psychological issues that they all have. As I was watching this film, I was trying to work out what the source of the horror was. Was it the ghosts of the past scratching through to the present? Was it aging itself? Was it madness? Was it dementia? Or was it perhaps all of these things coming together? If I have one problem with this film, it's in the idea that the horror in the story is centered around dementia. As some of the articles I've read about the film and about the director's story do strongly suggest. To me, this does seem a little bit cruel. As someone who's had a family member go through Alzheimer's, like so many people, I suspect that if other people in my family watch the film with this idea in mind, they would probably find it pretty upsetting. Making a horror film that presses our buttons around fears of aging and dementia is really effective, but something about it just sits a little bit uncomfortably with me. And I think it's in the film's suggestion that aging and dementia are like a sort of horror curse that the daughter will inevitably inherit. That does seem like a kind of cruel suggestion to the viewer. It is very effective as a horror device, and horror is necessarily transgressive. It's got to push those buttons of taboo. But I'm wondering if we really want to demonize or make a monster of a person suffering from dementia. If the film was specifically intended to be about dementia, I felt like it might have been more interesting if they'd played more with that idea that Edna's consciousness is actually slipping away into some other dimension, and that dimension is something the story perhaps could have explored. I had originally thought the story might follow that line, but it ultimately did not go in that direction. But I still think that is a really interesting horror idea. Personally, I would rather see Relic as a film about madness in a sort of vague sense, rather than a film about dementia specifically. And I can't really say why. It's perhaps just my personal experience, and not really wanting to see dementia victims portrayed this way as monstrous. But I think the great thing about Relic is that it is ambiguous enough to allow different interpretations, so you can see it as a film just about madness if you want to. As a horror writer myself, I completely understand the idea of writing as therapy, and I totally get that this story perhaps came from the director's own experience, as the article I read did suggest. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't think it's wrong to write a horror film about dementia. I don't think the film shouldn't have done it. But if you have experience of dementia in your family, you might find some of the content pretty confronting. Sensitive subject matter aside, though, I would still highly recommend this film as an assured and compelling psychological horror film. It did remind me in some ways also of The Babadook, only with Relic, the focus is on the elderly rather than a child, and I think there are certainly some pretty interesting comparisons to be made between those two films. Relic also features superb performances from a very strong female cast. I was particularly impressed with Emily Mortimer's Australian accent, which a lot of actors struggle to get right, but she pretty much nails it. I also loved the casting of Bella Heathcote as Emily Mortimer's daughter, and the resemblance between them was so striking that at times I actually got them confused. It was also really great to see Australian theatre veteran Robyn Nevin in such a strong and big role, and I thought she did a really superb job. She runs the gamut of emotions here, from very vulnerable to absolutely terrifying. Relic is a fascinating and deeply unsettling movie that will stay with you. And rarely have I seen a horror film that feels so authentically nightmarish to watch, both in its imagery and in its mood. It's really well executed. Thank you so much for watching today, and I hope you'll join me next time. Bye.